This program is brought to you by Agnes Scott College. For more information about Agnes Scott College, please visit our website at agnescott.edu.
Talk season. Toby got his undergraduate degree in English education from Longwood College in Virginia, a master's degree in educational administration from William and Mary, a master's in English from Tennessee, a PhD in English education from Virginia. He has taught middle school and high school English, theater, and speech in public and private schools. His research interests are in alternative assessment, classroom practice, arts-based instruction, radical pedagogies, critical literacy, among other things. He has taught at Kennesaw State, University of Kentucky, and now we're fortunate to have him here. He has poems recently appearing in Eclipse, Connecticut Review, Yalobusha Review. I think I said that right.
Yalobusha.
His most recent article is in the Virginia English Bulletin. It's entitled, Putting Our Elbows on the Table, Pre-Service English Teachers Learn to Share and Respond. And he is working on a book manuscript, which will be an edited collection, to be entitled Severely Dramatized, Teacher Narratives About Drama-Based Instruction. This morning he will be talking to us on the topic of Chiaroscuro, the shadowed side of teaching artistry, so please join me in welcoming Toby.
Thank you, Hal. Thanks, Hal, and thanks everybody for coming. So, chiaroscuro, it is a very strange sounding word, which I actually first encountered when I was in high school. And I've been fascinated by the sound of that word ever since. And so this lecture gives me an opportunity to essentially use it as a metaphor for the work that I want to talk about with you today. So I've titled the talk Chiaroscuro, which is comes from Italian words, chiaro and oscuro, illuminating the shadowed side of teaching artistry. And I've sort of set myself a relatively ambitious and perhaps ultimately unrealizable goal with this talk, but we'll see. What I'm trying to do is develop this rather weighty and difficult to maintain metaphor about the world of art and the world of teaching. And I'm going to try to illuminate that for you as we move through this conversation today, which I've set up mostly as a sort of testament to some of the ways that I've been thinking about this and where I am. I see the work that I'm going to talk about with you today as ongoing, definitely. It's not a finished research project. It's kind of a lifelong research project to understand myself as a teacher and also what happens for my students in my classroom. So that's the sort of big picture piece of it. This is the abstract that I wrote for Hal when he asked me to write such a thing. And so I thought I'd bring it here and just offer it to you because it was the way that I was beginning to think about what I wanted to talk about with you today. It builds out of an article that I read a year or so ago. It's actually a paper by an Australian researcher named Sam Seller. The paper is called Generating Change in and Through Pedagogy. And it's a paper that he gave at a research conference in Australia. Where he does a lot of things, but one of the questions that he ultimately asks is this question: how do we make a classroom operate like a work of art? Which I became very interested in because I've had a lifelong interest in art, as you're going to see as I talk about some of the things that have led me to this project today, and also in teaching. And he builds his argument out of the work, I think, of a French writer from a book called A.C.M.E, which I read part of. It's a very complicated kind of text that this writer, Gutierrez, I think is his name, is working on. And what Seller has done is he's tried to distill some of the ideas that are there, and this is one of the questions that he generates. In very simplistically, Gutierrez's thesis is something like, the world is in trouble, and the ways that we're tending to deal with that trouble not working so well. So we need a new one, and his suggestion is what he calls an ethico-aesthetic intervention. So a response that is more artistic in nature. So this, as I said, it's sort of an unwieldy thing that I'm doing here. I've set myself a very complicated task to try to weave together a number of different ideas. One of my favorite pieces of literature is Tony Kushner's piece, Angels in America. And this quotation, "Show me the words that will reorder the world or else keep silent," sort of acts as a, we'll call it a framing mantra for what I'm going to do with you today, because it illustrates for me some notion that I'm working on, this idea that the work I'm doing in classrooms actually has the power to reorder the world, if we recognize that power. So here's this word, chiaroscuro. So the beginning of this talk, if we think of this sort of ridiculous metaphor of the talk as some sort of journey to someplace else, the beginning of it, this path that we're going to walk on, is a very sort of straight and flat path. Not all that interesting in a lot of ways. But what I'm hoping to do is to use that sort of beginning of the path to get us somewhere that is much more interesting. So a part along the journey that you'll find as interesting as I do. But I start with this definition of chiaroscuro, just in case there are people in this space who didn't know it. It's this funny word. Hal and I were talking about this right before the talk began. It's difficult to pronounce. But in simple language, it's essentially that painting technique or that drawing technique where the artist uses shadow, shading, in order to give us the sense that whatever the subject is that is represented is in 3 dimensions. So it came around, those of you who are the artists in the room, like Catherine can help me here, I think the 16th century or something like that, when artists sort of recognized this as the technique. And it really changed the way that we were able to view subjects as they were represented, because we were now able to see shadow and light in new ways. And here's an example. So what's on my left here as I face it is this photograph of the cup. There's the example of chiaroscuro. We see that essentially in 3D. And of course on the right, there's the counterexample. So to extend the metaphor, what I'm working on, in my head at least, and hopefully in my practice, is trying to do more of this work in my teaching and less of this. So trying to work out the shadows. Here's how I'm translating the metaphor. So I've got this long list of things that I want to talk with you about. So as I was thinking about this, you'll see how this all comes together in just a few minutes because of the theoretical pieces. I was trying to think, like, what brought me here? Like, why am I interested in doing this? How did I end up on this page? And so I started to work on this notion of drama generally, and what were those dramatic moments? Because chiaroscuro is an effect used to create drama. That's the idea of it. We want people to have a dramatic response to the work of art. So here's some things. So I did these 3 different categories. One of them is my life as a teacher. So I was a teacher in middle and high schools for several years. I worked in public schools. I taught 7th grade in public school my first year, which scared me to death. And then I went on to teach 8th grade, and then I taught 9th through 12th grade ultimately in my teaching career in high school. So I thought about, what is it that I actually remember from teaching? And these are some of the things. So I remember that an 11th grader locked me out of my classroom one day. That was a dramatic moment. I remember that I had a very good student. She was like one of the best students in the school. And she was in a class with me called Oral Performance of Literature. And we were working on a storytelling piece. And she was working on Rikki Tikki Tavi, those of you who know this little story about the mongoose. So she was working out all the characters and creating voices for them, et cetera. And we'd been working probably for about 20 or 30 minutes. She's a very good student. She would do anything I asked her. And she began to cry, like that sort of silent crying, like I didn't realize she was going to cry. And then suddenly the tears were running down her face. And I realized in that moment that I was pushing her too hard, which I had not realized before. So there was drama in that moment. I taught the story to build a fire, and I had my students at some point, one of my students pretended that his fingers were frozen, and he used pencils like they were the twigs that he was trying to build the fire with, and he set up the little fire scene in the middle of the classroom. And I taught the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, which those of you who know it is a sort of fictionalized account of a woman who lives for about 100 years, starting as a slave and lives into the 20th century. One of the stories within the book is the story of a white slave owner's son who falls in love with one of the slaves. And so that question of interracial marriage is in the book. And my 8th graders took on that question. It was a really interesting conversation. From my work as somebody who's studying art. So I told you earlier that I've been very interested in art all my life. So chiaroscuro, here it shows up in the first one. So in high school, my art teacher says to me, and I remember these exact words, she said, about a tree I was drawing, make the lights lighter and the darks darker. Like, create the drama in that way. When I studied acting, this is one of the ways that I learned ultimately to think about teaching text to students. I think I'd had a whole undergraduate program in literature, and I loved literature, and I was loved it when I was in high school, and I loved to read, etc. But it wasn't until I became an acting student that I understand how to take apart a text, because I had to do that in order to understand how to produce an effect for the audience. I had to really understand what the character was saying, even though I'd written a lot of papers about literature before that moment. Failing miserable to achieve any competence in the technique of photo emulsion transfer in the printmaking class I took when I was in college. So if you don't know what that is, and I don't expect that most of you do, at least when I was doing this in the 1980s, we were doing silk screening. We had a process by which we were supposed to use this special paper that you work with, and then you put a light on, and the light essentially takes out parts of the paper so that when you end up with a reverse print, essentially. So you have now an open space on your screen that you can pull paint through. So I completely blew this, and my print was awful. And yet, I loved the experience of being that involved with the process, even though I didn't do it well. Getting cast in my first role, and this is the important part. It's not that I got cast, it was because I knew that it was because I'd done a good audition. Like, that's the piece of it that's important. And then this last piece, one of the sort of iterations of my career life has been working in career services, and I worked in an architecture school in Virginia, and I'd never worked around architecture students before, but if you don't know architecture students, like art students, they are committed folk, and they spent hours and hours and hours in their studios because they were fascinated by their projects, not because they were assigned to do so, just because they were so interested in their own work. And finally, as I think about myself as a student and a learner, these are some of the things that showed up as dramatic moments in my memory. Taking a course in graduate school, I have had, I don't know, I should sit down and count them, the number of courses that I've had over my academic career. This is the only one out of all of them where the teacher ever said to us, you generate the topics for this course, which was a fascinating moment for me. Then this idea of getting a B in voice class in college and knowing that I deserved the B, because I was an A student in college. I didn't get Bs generally, and so the fact that I got a B in voice class was annoying to me, and yet at the same time I knew that it was what I deserved because I had not worked as hard in my voice class as I should have. And then this sort of counterexample, getting a C+ in bowling, which is the only C I ever got in college, and knowing that I was a much better bowler at the end of that class than I was at the beginning. So recognizing that that didn't really represent my learning at all. This will come up in just a few minutes as well, winning the school poetry contest when I was in 6th grade. What happened at that moment for me is that I began to think of myself as a poet, and that was an enormously important moment in my sort of identity formation. And then this last piece, taking a poetry workshop with Sharon Olds, those of you who know Sharon Olds' work, in which she told me that praise is a better teacher than criticism. That was a really important moment for me. And then she pointed to one line in my poem that she thought worked. But she didn't point to any of the ones that she didn't think worked. So that's I'll call that sort of the background piece that got me here. And then here's the theory that sort of will ultimately, I hope, translate into an understanding of what I'm doing in just a few minutes. So this is also a quote from Kushner, "Theory, how are we to proceed without theory?" So what I'd like to do in this part of the talk is try to demonstrate for you some of the things that have sort of informed how I've got here in terms of what I've been reading and what I've been thinking about. And this is over the course of, I'd say 6 or 7 years. So some of the key ideas that I want to talk to you about are critical literacy, multiple intelligences, transformational teaching practice, and then finally this idea of action research. And I think as I talk through some of the theory, some of what I've done earlier, remember the sort of flat part of the path, it will begin to make sense about how we're going to climb somewhere else. So let's start with critical literacy. So that's a term that's been bandied about for at least 25 years in the literature. What I thought I'd do is talk about some of the people I've read who've sort of led me to where I am in my own pedagogy practice. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these folks. I know you know a lot about them in a lot of cases, but I do want to hit on some of their major ideas that are influencing what I'm doing. So the first one is Freire's idea of critical consciousness, which is in simple language, if I were to talk about it with 3rd graders, for example, I might say it's something like this idea that part of our work to be educated is to be aware of our own sort of perspectives and how that plays out, and then to be critical of the things that are around us. So it's an awareness. We all do this kind of work in our classrooms all the time. But Freire was one of the first people that I ever read who named it cleanly for me. Then Ira Shore, who is also a critical literacy theorist, has this idea of subjective positioning, which is very closely connected to this idea of critical consciousness, that we all come to information from a certain position. And Dewey's idea of experiential education, that if we really want people to be educated, we give them a chance to experience something where they create. And then Miles Myers, I don't know if you know Miles Myers' work. He's an English education guy, and he has this book called Changing Our Minds that came out about 10 years ago, in which he says that for people to be literate in the 21st century, they have to be able to translate text from one mode to another. That was a really interesting idea for me. I had not considered that in such specific terms before. Sam Seller, whose paper I'm sort of basing this idea for the talk on, has this idea of aesthetic response to social disruption. And then Boal, I don't know if you know Boal's work. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of him and know something about him. David obviously knows his work. A contemporary of Freire, and actually Boal's still alive, he's a Brazilian. Freire's book was his original idea was called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Boal wrote a book ultimately called Theater of the Oppressed, and what he does essentially is what Freire does with art. So he takes theater and says that theater has the potential to be a weapon for revolution, for real change. Howard Gardner's ideas about multiple intelligence, I know most of you have heard this before, so I just stuck them here for us to have as a reminder. Howard Gardner's a Harvard professor. He came up with this idea several years ago, essentially that the way that we've been measuring intelligence all these years since the early 1900s, probably not the best way to be thinking about how people are actually intelligent. And so he's given us a continuum, a scale, a categorization of different kinds of intelligences, which go beyond sort of what we tend to think of as IQ. And he has 8 right now. There is a 9th one that's sort of being developed, which is a spiritual kind of intelligence, which is it's a difficult one, but he doesn't really have that one on the list yet. And then this idea from Vygotsky, which is this zone of proximal development, which means that as a learner, I have these things that I know already, and the best way for me to essentially add to what I know is to have something to be offered an opportunity that's just a little harder than what I'm already able to accomplish, because I will likely reach for that. But if the opportunity is way harder, then my natural response will be not to reach for it. So that's part of the theory I'm playing with here as well. And then the theorists that are connected to transformational teaching for me, bell hooks. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on bell hooks at all. I've read several of her books, but one of the ideas that resonates for me in this work is this idea of the colonizing mindset, that education has a tendency to colonize us. And her idea is that we have to fight against that. Freire's idea of liberatory practice, which is very much like this, which essentially it is the goal of teachers to offer students the chance to be liberated by the work. And then back to Sam Seller's work, this idea of classroom operating as a work of art suggests somehow that the teacher is an artist. And it's a much broader definition than just like teacher is sculptor or teacher is painter. I'll talk a bit more about that. And then Harvey Daniels' idea. Harvey Daniels is a teacher practitioner, researcher. He has this book about representing to learn, which is, in simple terms, ways other than writing that we represent the ways that we know. And then action research. Now, it's a research strategy that's pretty particular to the research on teaching and learning. And there are a lot of action researchers, but I just pulled 3 because these people are really connected to what I'm doing. So Nancy Atwell is a classroom researcher. She is a teacher, a middle school teacher. She writes about teaching writing particularly, but the way that she ultimately came to her theory is she reflected on her own practice. So that idea of self-reflection. That gave her a theory of practice, recognizing what she did and thinking about what she wanted to change. And then Lucy Calkins, who also does writing work, has this notion of classroom as laboratory, that's what the classroom should be. We're supposed to be learning and experimenting in the classroom all the time. And then Sam Seller's idea about classroom as the artist studio. Okay, that's the theoretical grounding. Then here's my bias. So I have these experiences from my life, as being a teacher, as being a student, as being somebody who is hoping to be an artist. I have this theoretical background where I've been reading and thinking, and then I have what do I want to do in the world? So here's my bias. So here's how I got there. Several things about me that put me in this place. So even when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a good teacher. And that's the way I would have talked about it. I wanted to be a good teacher. And then this notion that even the best teachers I've ever had were mechanized in a certain way to the routines that they had been offered and the routines that they had developed. That goes very much back to Boal's idea of theater as a tool of revolution. He believes that our bodies are all mechanized, and the only way to revolt essentially is to change the mechanization. my commitment to living in what I'm calling an art-full world, a world full of art, my own need to experiment and engage and create and revel in question, and then just this notion of entertaining myself. Like one of the sort of guidelines I have for myself when I'm designing a lesson is I think, am I going to be interested in teaching this? Am I going to be interested in my own work? And if the answer is no, and I will say that when I was teaching 7th graders my first year, often it was no. I learned a lot from that in sort of a Nancy Atwellian way. So that's sort of my researcher bias. So my motive, I'm talking about a lot of this in researcher talk. So one of the ideas in action research in particular is like, why do you want to change something? What's the motivating discontent? What are you discontented about? And so I lay this out in terms of questions, and these are the questions that guide this next piece of the talk, which is going to be some samples of what I've been doing. So here's what I'm asking myself. So how do we reinvigorate the cliche of the teacher-student dynamic? How might we avoid codifying what is new, what is innovative? How important a concept is style to the philosophy of decodifying pedagogy? So let me stop and talk about that a little bit. This is an idea that comes directly from Sam Seller, and by extension from the theorist that he was reading. So his idea is this. Remember, he says, can the classroom operate like a work of art? He believes perhaps, but he thinks that the only way that that can truly happen and the only way that change will ultimately take place is by accretion. So it can't be like revolt, and there were people that would disagree with him, but it can't be revolt because people respond to revolt in ways that don't allow them to change. It has to be essentially, remember the Vygotsky idea, like little step at a time. And he calls this small accretion of steps style. Like changing style can ultimately make a big change. So if you change enough small things, ultimately you'll have the big thing. And he uses this metaphor of the football player. Now that is not a useful metaphor for me because I don't know much about football. I could have done a whole other thing about like negative experiences from my childhood that have led me to things as well. That would be one of them. I won't go there today. But what I will tell you is that in his football metaphor, this is what he says, that this idea of style is kind of like this. If you are a football player and you're a really good one, then you probably do all the same things that all the other good football players do, like in terms of like the categories of things that you learn to do, the moves that you make, the instructions that you follow, et cetera. And yet there's something that you know how to do, and it's small. The small things that you know how to do that make you better than the other football players, that make you terrific. And so his idea is essentially, Sam Seller's idea is that that's the thing that we're looking for in teaching. That is that small thing, those small incremental changes that we can make that will ultimately lead to winning the game, okay, if we play out that particular metaphor. So what might we learn about innovation by examining the ethos of training of artists? So this goes back to what I was thinking about with regard to myself as an artist. I told you this short story about learning to read text closely by training to be an actor. And this seems like a metaphor that could play out in other situations and scenarios as well. Like, what is it about the training of artists? Why did the architects love spending hours and hours in their studio? Why did I love the printmaking stuff even though I was really bad at it? It's something about the training. It was something about the experience. It was something about the process that was important. And there's an ethos, I think, in there that can be translated for teaching. And then finally, this is, I think, part of that ethos. How can the ethos of self-initiated project-based work, which I think is what's at play. I know it was what was at play for the architects. I know it was what was at play with me as an actor. I think it's what was at play with me when I was studying art. How can that ethos be committed about project-based work and commitment to experimentation be translated? So those are my questions. For myself, which leads me to, what do I want to do in my classroom? And so this is the research project that I've been working on for several years now. What I'm trying to do is try this stuff, try to answer some of these questions by making specific practical choices in my work so that ultimately I'm doing the style work. I'm like taking the small steps with the hope that ultimately what I do is going to have an enormous impact, that there's going to be a big change for me and for my students. And so what I've tried to do in my own practice is I've tried to imagine and reimagine what would happen if I demechanized my own process. So if I were able to see things in new ways, using the theory, like I'm not jumping off from someplace I've never been before, but how can I use the theory to change style? So I've done a lot of data gathering. I have a computer full of information. It's almost full. It gave me a message the other day that says it's almost full. But what I thought I'd do this morning is I would just highlight 3 very particular projects, and I've picked them from different places. The double speak project that I want to talk to you about is from work that I did. It was a research project, a short-term research project that I did with 7th and 8th graders in Lexington, Kentucky when I was teaching there. And the Transformations project is an ongoing practice that I've been playing with for about 4 years now, I think, where I'm working with video, and I'll show you an example of one in a few minutes, with all the pre-service teachers that I work with and all of the in-service teachers that I work with. So when I go into other places and do workshops with teachers, I teach them this strategy, and I'll show it to you in just a minute. And then I gather everything that they do. I hold all that data. And then I want to show you finally this thing that I'm calling a radically alternative culminating assessment, which is it's a final exam kind of strategy. So here's the doublespeak project. So I was invited by the Carnegie Center for Literacy, which is a community-based organization in Lexington, Kentucky, to do a fluency project with middle schoolers. So their intention was to help the middle schoolers read better. That's what they meant by fluency. They wanted them to read better. They wanted them to read out loud better. They wanted them to read silently better. They wanted to be more fluent. And so they asked me to design a research project. Well, I was working with graduate students at the time, and so I invited 3 of my graduate students to do this project with me. And what we chose to do, that's all they gave us, like do a fluency project, do a reading project. And what we chose to do, building on a lot of the things that I've just offered you here, is to create a 4-week fluency project in which we asked the students to interact with poems. We thought, okay, they're 7th graders, they're 8th graders. This is one of those moments where it could be a seminal moment for them about poetry. They can learn to love poetry. They can be people who hate poetry for the rest of their lives, which is normally what happens to 7th or 8th graders, unless they're like me in 6th grade and they happen to win the poetry contest. Like that was an important moment for me. But I was the only 6th grader who won the poetry contest. None of the rest of them did. They didn't have that experience. So we went into we did an after-school program. We met for 4 weeks with the students for about 2 hours a week. And our objective was to ask them to respond to poems in ways that they had never responded to poems before. So we really wanted to, sort of play with this metaphor, give them the shadow side of poetry life. Like, how could we make this a more rounded experience for them? How could we let it not be the cup on the right, let it be the cup on the left? And so we created what we thought were pretty interesting activities for them with the ultimate goal of doing a reader's theater performance. So remember it's fluency we're working on. So the last thing we asked them to do on the 4th meeting was to read the script that they ultimately were able to create by responding to poems. Those are some of the students. So we were working in a classroom in a middle school. I will say this middle school, you understand how this works in school systems. Like there's the 1 or 2 schools who are always considered the bad ones, the struggling ones, and this middle school was that one. And it was the feeder middle school for one of the high schools that my students were doing research in. Here's how we set it up. So week 1, we did what we called priming for fluency. So we just asked them to respond to poems in brand new ways, creating language, creating actual text that we could play with later, and looking at the poems. And then the second week, we asked them to write poems of their own in response to some of the poems. And in the third week, we helped them create the reader's theater script. And in the 4th week, they performed it. So they worked very quickly. Like we were talking about 8 or 9 hours total that they were able to do this project. And ultimately, they created something really interesting, which I'll show you a little piece of. All right, so here's what we asked them to do in week 2. So I've asked a couple of people to help me with this. I don't know if you know this poem by Jane Yolen, Fat is Not a Fairy Tale, but I've asked Carrie to read it for you. So Carrie, would you mind doing that? So it's here for you, and Carrie's going to read it as well. So we're looking at the one that's on my left as I face the screen. So we gave this poem to the students, and we asked them to read it, and then we asked them to respond to it. So here's what they did with the reading. Thank you, Carrie. So it's a fabulous piece, right? And we brought it to the 7th and 8th graders, and we asked them to, remember the idea is fluency, which we translated to mean comprehension and understanding as well as reading out loud. And so we wanted them to interact with these texts in ways that really gave them a deep understanding of the work. And so this is what one of the students wrote. All right? She had this piece as her original, and then we asked her essentially to imitate what she saw going on structurally and thematically in the poem. And she wrote, I am thinking of a music star, Jessie McCantsing, Britney Sears, Aerosmith, where the songs are not love songs to future exes. I'm thinking of a movie star, Orlando Blank, Johnny Dope, Brad Pitts, where he is not plastered on every girl's wall. I am thinking of a star that is not yet popular, for an audience not yet known, for a crash diet not yet invented, for a special friend not yet dumped, where everything abnormal is good, the song, poster, fan base, and love life. So remember, we were working with them for about 8 hours total, and she did this in about 20 minutes. So with assistance, I mean, we've given them, all this is scaffolded, like we've given them very specific structures to work within. But my guess is that this student has a very different experience of this poem than she had of most of the poems that she had interacted with in her life. So ultimately, what we did with this work, we continue to ask the students, this is very Freirean in its sort of concept, we continue to ask the students to respond very specifically to the poems with their own language. So we were essentially laying their words alongside the work of the professional poet. And we were saying, your works, your ideas count too. And we did this in a number of ways. But what we ended up with was this very interesting structure, narrative structure, where we had all kinds of responses that they'd given us, and then we tried to help them ultimately dovetail all that together to create something that they could perform. So Leslie looked at I asked Leslie to read a little piece of this, and she looked and said something like, oh, and it doesn't make an awful lot of sense, like looking at it out of context. And it's true, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense if you just look at it out of context. But what the students were doing is they were trying to interact with poems in ways that allow them to say, it's perfectly reasonable to have questions of poems, to not understand them necessarily, to not be able to parse each line. In fact, we had started the whole workshop with Billy Collins's poem, An Introduction to Poetry, which, if you don't know it, says something like, I'd like the students to look at the poem this way, drop a mouse into it, hold it up to the light like a colored slide, etc. All they want to do is tie it to a chair and beat a confession out of it. That's his poem. And so that's where we'd started. We sort of framed the whole workshop with that. And we asked them to be imaginative in their responses to poems. So in one place, we had poems about poetry up on the wall on chart paper. We had Ars Poetica, the McLeish poem, and we had the Billy Collins poem, and we had a Neruda poem about writing poetry. And we asked them to respond to those poems with these sort of imaginative kinds of ways. So we gave them these responses. We said, in this poem's pockets are. And then they would write that was the stem, and they would write their response. And so we used that ultimately to create scenes that they performed for their parents and their teachers on this last day. So I thought we'd just read this one little scene, and I've asked different people in the room to read it. We titled this scene Poetry Jive. These are 8th graders who are ultimately performing this piece. So you can hear a little bit of what they did. So I'll do reader 5 because you'll see that that's a repeated character. And then I've asked other people in the room to read the other pieces. So here's their little scene, Poetry Jive. Reader 5 says, in this poem's pockets are
a yo-yo and 75 cents for blue raspberry snow.
If this poem were a burrito, it would.
Drip down the front of someone's shirt when they're on their way to a fancy party.
So I was sitting next to this poem waiting for the bus, and it.
Got up and tap danced, collecting $3.25 and change in its hat.
This poem is hiding.
It's mismatched thought.
Okay. So see a very kind of imaginative, what I would say, aesthetic response to art. So we're asking them to have an artful response to art, as opposed to some other kinds of responses that they could have had, which they had been able and asked to do many, many times in the past. And ultimately, they created this little piece that they performed for their parents and their teachers and their friends. So that's the Readers Theater Project. The Transformation Project. So this builds on Miles Meyer's idea about translation of text from one idea to the next. It also builds on the work of Kenneth Koch. I don't know if you know him, but Kenneth Koch is a poet and a teacher. He did work in the 60s with very young children in New York City, where he asked them to respond to very difficult pieces in terms of poetry, very classic pieces, Shakespearean pieces, Blake's pieces. And so he's working with 3rd graders, and he's asking them to write back to William Blake's poems. And so this work that I'm doing now with some of my students is translated from Miles Meyer's idea about moving from one text form to another, but also from Kenneth Koch's idea about how to use imitation, which is an artist's tool. Like, it is an artist's tool, essentially, to imitate the way that other good artists have worked in the past in order to ultimately transcend the imitation to get to something else. So here's the project design. There are steps in this process. So what I do right now, there is a book by Billy Collins. When he was Poet Laureate, he put together a collection of poems for teachers called Poetry 180. And they're all contemporary pieces. There are 180 of them because there are about 180 days in the school year. Remember, his idea is that we shouldn't be beating poems up. We should just be enjoying them. So the idea is that teachers could just share the poem or read the poem with the students one a day for 180 days. It would change the way, small steps, it would change the way that we interact and love poetry if we just put it in the space and didn't try to tear it up. So using that text, I asked the teachers to select any poem that they'd like from that text. And then I asked them to write what I call an illumination and an invitation. And I'm going to show you an example of that. And then they write a poem of their own. So now they're responding like the student did to Fat is Not a Fairy Tale by writing their own piece. And finally, they translate that to film. So you see this idea of Miles Myers that's working in here where they translate to get to something else. And then finally, they translate again by introducing the poem to an audience, the new movie. So I'll show you really quickly how the illumination and the invitation works. So I've selected a poem. In this case, I'm just showing you a poem from Tess Gallagher. This is I Stopped Writing the Poem, which I've asked David to read for us. That's the whole piece. It's a very short little poem. So David, would you do that?
I stopped writing the poem to fold the clothes. No matter who lives or who dies, I'm still a woman. I'll always have plenty to do. I bring the arms of his shirt together. Nothing can stop our tenderness. I'll get back to the poem. I'll get back to being a woman. But for now, there's a shirt, a giant shirt in my hands. And somewhere, a small girl standing next to her mother, watching to see how it's done.
Thank you, David. So that's the piece. And then what I asked the students to do, and see, this is kind of traditional in the initial part, the illumination. I asked them to essentially analyze the poem in a very small space. So they only have a couple of paragraphs or so to do the analysis, which I call an illumination. So I asked them to find something in the poem, structurally, thematically, imagistically, that they are interested in, and to write about that. So in this example, this is from a book, Moon Crossing Bridge, in which several of the poems are about grief. Tess Gallagher, if you don't know, was the companion of Raymond Carver, who, before this book came out, had passed away. And so there's this theme rippling through the poems in the book. But this particular poem about with this image of the woman folding the arms of the shirt and then thinking of the person that's lost, sort of begins the sort of my analysis of what's going on here. That's the illumination, like here's what I see happening in the poem. And then here's what I call the invitation. So I say to some other writer, here's what I see, here's what you might think about doing yourself. And it really is an invitation, it's not an assignment. The idea is that we're using the work of other good writers to create work of our own. So in this case, I'm asking them to essentially play with the structure and also play with this idea, the thematic piece that she's working with, where she picks a particular chore and she situates that within this emotional context. And then the student would write the poem of his own or her own. And then ultimately, they take the poem and they translate it to film using Movie Maker, which is a free software that comes as part of the Word package. So I thought I'd show you one little poem that a student made a couple of years ago. This is actually, he had the same invitation that the middle school student had, the Fat is Not a Fairy Tale invitation, that one of the students in the class had picked. She had picked that poem. She did the illumination, she wrote the invitation, and then Juan Lee, that's whose piece you're going to see right now, he wrote a poem and then he did a little movie about the poem. So this is his translation of that text that he wrote.
Was in another lifetime, one of toil and blood, when blackness was a virtue, the road was full of mud. I came in from the wilderness, a creature void of form. Come in, she said, I'll give you shelter from the storm. And if I pass this way again, you can rest.
Excuse me.
Yeah?
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay. For what gender do you think nursing is an appropriate career, male or female?
You said appropriate? Which one is it appropriate for?
Yeah.
Female.
No, female.
Both. And what gender do you think is appropriate for cheerleading?
Cheerleading? Both. My husband was a cheerleader in high school and college.
Okay, great.
Paid his way through all the games. Got to go for free.
Female. I guess either.
Definitely girls.
She said, I'll give you shelter from the storm. And if I pass this way again, you can rest assured I'll always do my best for her, on that I give my word. In a world of steel-eyed death and men who are fighting to be warm, come in, she said, I'll give ya shelter from the storm. Not a word was spoke between us, there was a little risk involved. Everything up to that point had been left unresolved. Try imagining a place where it's always safe and warm. Come in, she said, I'll give you shelter from the storm.
Okay, so I will say, like when the teachers create these little films, remember my story about the printmaking? Like they're not always very good. And that's perfectly okay, because the engagement with the process is what's important here. It's this sort of this stylistic concern, not necessarily the product concern. And that's a shift in some regards for this idea that there is something important about the engagement with the process, that has its own sort of power. Here's the final piece that I want to tell you about. So I'm calling this radically alternative culminating assessment. So this is a project that I began at the University of Kentucky, which I used last summer with the MAT students here. So Carrie had a chance to play with this particular strategy. So I was teaching a course there, unlike the course I teach here, which is slightly the same, but also different, because here we only have a few disciplines that are represented in the course. But there was a foundations course for all the MAT students. It was their first course of the year. It was a cross-discipline course. I had business students, I had math students, I had science students, I had English students, I had social studies. Everybody was in the same class because it was a foundations course. So they also had texts that had all been decided on before I got there. Like it was a standardized course, so it was all laid out before I arrived. And the assignments had been created, etc. Which I would say it doesn't really suit me as a teacher, but that's what I had. So I walked into that. So I was trying to imagine what I could do that would allow the students to take all that information and synthesize it, because remember, I didn't design any of it, and they weren't liking a lot of it. And so my sense was that they had done a lot of things that were probably useful to them, but because they were so green to the process, they didn't know how to reflect on it. So part of my objective was to help them do that. And then I built on all those things that I wrote about before as I was talking with you, trying to imagine what a strategy might be that would help them. And I came up with this Reader's Theater piece that they created. So what they had to do is they had to take all of the work that they had looked at throughout the semester, the reading that they'd done, the journaling that they'd done, the observations that they'd made in the classrooms, because that was part of their work, et cetera, and to try to generate themes that somehow suggested themselves from that work. And then to use those themes to categorize scenes within a script. And then that was the assignment, which they did sort of as their final exam. And then ultimately they were able to present it to all of their peers. Now this is it's a big place. There were about 20 people in my class. There were 3 other classes of the same size. So they presented it to about 100 people later. That was one of the other steps in it. But then I asked 6 of them to come back and work on the scripts with me again and to translate it anew. And I think I had 3 or 4 teams working in my class. We took the work of all 3 scripts and we tried to combine that. And then we took that script to a state teachers conference. And I had 6 of my students perform it. So again, I'm letting them translate again what happens for them. And so I'll show you just a little bit of some of what they did. This is one scene that they wrote, and this is based on an actual observation in a classroom. So Susanna was the teacher who was in the classroom. And I'll just read a couple of lines from it. So she says to her student, "Do you need any help with your Greek newspaper?" He says, "I've got a pin top in my ear." She says, "Al, does that hurt?" He says, "No, not anymore. Do you like the Beatles, Miss Kilborn?" "Yeah, I like the Beatles all right, but I'm surprised you do. I thought you were all about Insane Clown Posse. They scare me." The student says, "I like all kinds of stuff. We had to find a song that represents us, so I chose Imagine." "Imagine? Wow, did you know that John Lennon wrote that song about communism?" "No way, it's not about that. It's about creating a world for yourself. It doesn't say there's no heaven. It says imagine there's no heaven, no possessions, no religion. It takes the pressure off, you know." The teacher says, "Good words, but how can you incorporate that into your Greek newspaper?" So that was based on an actual moment from the classroom. Like, this really happened. So then the script includes this postscript, the reflection, essentially, like where the teacher thinks about what happened in the classroom and turns that into language. And so you see this piece from Emma that says, "Dear Journal, I've really struggled to keep my students on task," so on and so forth. So that was the reflection. So that's a small piece from the script that they wrote that we ultimately took with us. But I thought I'd show you just a couple of things that the students said about it. This one's long, and I'm just going to point to a couple of things that I think are important here. So in my research process, in the data gathering, I also asked the students, obviously, to tell me what they thought about this process, this notion of translation. And so the part that I want to point to here is the last thing that Josh wrote, and Josh was a social studies teacher. So he wrote about this whole process. I leave with this parting thought. It's not a stretch to say that this whole process of RT, which is Reader's Theater, and the relationships I have formed because of it, has been my most richly rewarding experience this semester. And those are his words. This is what he wrote about it. Dwayne was a language arts teacher, and he says, as I said in the Q&A session this is the conference we went to, KCTE, the Reader's Theater text has actually become a text that I mentally reference more often than I do any other that we have used during the MIC program. Now that's as Freirean as it gets, right there, when the student creates a text that becomes the instruction. And then John, who is a social studies teacher, says, "Theater's clever because the educational component is sneaky. A script is written," passive voice here, "characters are created, a performance is given, and upon reflection, the realization that specific information has been absorbed is recognized. It doesn't feel like education because it does not look like what most people perceive as teaching." All right, so those are the students' responses. So those are 3 examples. I have many, many more because, as I said, I have a computer full of data that I'm collecting on this research project. We are very close on time. So here's sort of where I end my own process for today, at least. It's with another quote from Angels in America, which is, the great question before us is, will the past release us? Is it possible not to be mechanized by the system? And the great question before us is, can we change? Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Al.